All right, today's lesson is on using OPTIC for image analysis. I'm going to go through this pretty quickly because we'll be using it throughout the year. But the word OPTIC stands for the way that we analyze images when we see them for the AP exam, perhaps, and the synthesis essay, or also when we see them just in everyday life. So we're going to talk today about these 5 different pieces to analyzing an image. Today we're going to be talking about analyzing photography because that's your first project. So the first portion of OPTIC is overview. And overview, when you're looking at a photograph, is basically 3 things. The first part of the overview is a summary, or what I kind of refer to as reading the image. What that means is that you basically read the image out loud to the audience, because most of the time you're doing this in presentation mode, or you write it to describe it as if someone who is blind you're trying to describe it to someone who's blind. So it's basically just saying what it is that you're seeing. You're not putting any meaning or anything behind it. You're just kind of summarizing what you see. The next part of the overview is when you explain what kind of general knowledge you have of the subject matter. So this could be something that you know in advance because you look at it and you happen to know like something about the time period that the picture was taken in, or you know something about the person in the picture or the type of people in the picture, or the subject matter of the picture itself. But this is something that you don't research. It's what you know ahead of time. And then the third part is information that you find out about the subject through research that you do. So once you do your general knowledge, then you actually research the image. And I'm not saying you look up the title of the image or anything else. I'm saying you find some information about the image. It could be the place that the image is taken in. It could be the person in the image. It could be something about the time period. It could be something about the subject or topic of the image. And you provide a little bit of information beyond what you already knew about the image. All right, so this is one of the larger parts actually of the entire OPTIC analysis is the overview, because you're doing first the summary and reading the image, then providing what you knew ahead of time, and then explaining what you found out through research. So it might take a little while to do that. All right, the second part, the P, stands for parts. And this is where you divide the image into its major parts and you explain each part. This is where you might get involved in like symbolism or how the parts relate to each other. Okay? And like there can be a lot of small parts, but sometimes you have to like group pieces or parts of an image together. And I'll show you as an example coming up. Okay, so that's parts. The T stands for title, and this is kind of easier. There's 2 ways to do it. First, a lot of images have titles, so there might be an existing title. If there is an existing title, then you explain why the image is titled the way it is. Then you provide an alternative title. So that you can kind of say, well, this is the original title, and this is why it was titled that way and why it makes sense. But here's an alternative title that I think also works, and then explain why you think that is effective. If there is no existing title, then you provide a title and explain why you chose that title. Okay, so that's the title. Interrelationships is referring to the relationship between you, the audience, and the image. So it involves 2 things. First is personal connections. So it could be personal connections to the subject matter, personal connections to the time period, how basically you reveal something about yourself that kind of reveals how you read this image. And I'll show you an example again in a moment. The other part of this is where you provide a value analysis. Basically, discuss how effective the painting or the picture is. And one of the reasons why that's in interrelationships is because oftentimes our personal connections to images and art affect how we see the value of that. So for value analysis, you're talking about, I like this image. It speaks to me because of these things. I think it's effective because of these things. So you're actually giving a judgment call on the image itself, which is kind of rare in analysis. Usually you don't provide a critique, but this is kind of like a little bit of a critique. Okay, and so the last one is composition. And this is how the image is constructed. There are a lot of different parts of composition, but for this first project, we're just going to be looking at these three. The first is balance. And balance that we're looking for is if we are looking at something that is asymmetrical or symmetrical balance. And so you're going to be looking at the image. Symmetrical balance is something that has equal weight on both sides. So I'm going to show you an example. This picture right here is symmetrically balanced. Now it's got trees on both sides. It's got this backdrop right here. Even this little image down here at the bottom, I'm not exactly sure what it is, but it is symmetrically balanced in the middle. The one thing that's out of balance is the moon, but of course that's what provides it interest. If the moon were smack dab in the middle, it might not be quite as interesting of a piece. Now, symmetrical doesn't mean that it has to have this exact kind of mirror image quality to it, but it means that the weight of one image or one side of the image is kind of balanced with the other. If this was a tree and this was a building and we still had this like spot in between, that would still be considered symmetrically balanced because the weight of the tree and the weight of the building in terms of the picture kind of even themselves out. Now, asymmetrical balance, on the other hand, is a little bit more like this. If you look at this image and you divide this image in half this way, you look at it and you say, well, that's not really vertically symmetrically balanced. These big buildings do not equal the weight of these small bikes like tied to this area right here. So this is asymmetrically balanced vertically. Horizontally, however, you might be able to make a statement for there being more balance. But again, the detail up here is kind of not equal to the detail down here. So this is an asymmetrically balanced picture. The interesting thing is that we, as human beings, prefer symmetrical balance. Usually, we look at this and we find it more visually appealing than the image, this asymmetrically balanced image. That's just the way we are. All right, back to here. So that's balance. So first you say whether it's symmetrical or asymmetrical, and you explain why that's effective to use that. Angle, you're looking at a couple different things. You are looking at the angle of the viewer to the subject. So you could be above the subject, you could be below the subject, you could be on an even level with the subject. And I'm also wanting you to consider distance from the subject. Is it a close-up angle that you're looking at? Is it a distant angle, or is it like a mid-range? And so I want you to talk about that and why we would have that particular angle. Okay, lastly, the color. First of all, if it is in full color, you want to think about the symbolism of the colors. If there is partial color, you also want to think about the symbolism of the color. For example, a photoshopped image where like one thing is the color red or the color blue or something like that, and then you have to explain why the artist chose that particular color there and what it might symbolize or tell us. Then there are two different options that we're really going to be exploring: black and white and grayscale. Difference between black and white and grayscale is pretty simple. If there's an image that has any shades of gray in it, it's considered grayscale. A lot of times we refer to non-color photography as black and white photography, but in fact it is a grayscale photography. Otherwise it would be just black and white and no gray at all. But a lot of times when we're going to be looking at political cartoons and things like that, that's when we're seeing something that's traditionally black and white. All right, that's the optic analysis. Let me just show you really quickly how that works with this image. This is an image called depression. I'm going to tell you the overview really quickly. There is what appears to be a man or a young man sitting in the doorway of a wooden door. And you will notice that the floor is also made of wood, and you can kind of see his shadow reflected upon the floor because the open door opens onto what appears to be a very brightly lit bedroom. In the back here, you can kind of see what looks to be like a bed quilt or comforter that's sort of tossed over the bed, and the light is coming out of the room and shining on this boy and therefore casting his shadow. Off to the right or left of the image, right of the boy, you will see that there is a large dark area here where there doesn't seem to be any kind of definition or anything like that. My general knowledge of this piece, first, the title of this piece is called Depression, and I know that depression is a disease that affects a certain amount of the population. My general knowledge, I feel like depression is becoming more and more common. Maybe not more than it used to be, but it's certainly more diagnosed than it used to be. I think people are less embarrassed to be diagnosed with depression than they used to be, like, say, when I was a teenager, for example. And so I think that that might cause the reason why we think that there's more people who are undergoing depression now than there used to be. When I do some background research about this, I find out that women are more likely to be depressed than men, that 20% of teenagers or children become depressed at some point before they turn the age of 18. In America, the general population depression percentage is about 6.4, where globally it's only 5%. So you could kind of make the argument that Americans tend to be slightly more depressed than the average global citizen. And so that is what I'm going to be using as my research for this. Okay, parts. I see basically, maybe 5 parts. So there's the boy, probably the most important part number 1. Part number 2 is the open doorway and the room beyond. Part number 3 is the blackness over here. And part number 4 is the floor and the shadow on the floor that I'm looking at right here in this. Now, some people might decide to separate the doorway from the bedroom in the background and create 5 parts, but I kind of see it as 1, 2, 3, and 4. So when I see this person having been placed right directly into the doorway, it sort of gives me the message of depression being something where you're sort of stuck in the middle between the darkness that could come into your life and the lightness that maybe you want to go to, but you're unable to actually make that movement for yourself. If you look at the way that the subject of the picture is sitting, you'll see that he appears to be somewhat hopeless, kind of with his head on his knee. I'm referring to this person as a he, and that's only because there's a shadow of a mustache right there. But otherwise, it's really gender neutral. You don't look at it and think masculine right away, which I think is deliberate on the part of the artist. So, and also deliberate on the part of the artist to have the face in shadows so that we don't actually see any distinguishing features, and therefore we can place either ourselves or someone that we know into this picture. The floor, the shadow on the floor, provides us a little bit of the balance, I guess, and explains which direction the light is coming in from. So that kind of gives us a little bit more, which leads into my title. The title is Depression. It's an all right title, but it's more of a label, I think, than an actual title. So I would say that maybe my new title would be Consumed by Shadows, because that's something that you kind of feel like when you're feeling like you're under depression. And the shadows here, kind of the darkness takes up more parts of this picture than the light does. So that's why I would choose that. Interrelationships. I have a complicated relationship with depression. My mother, at one point in her life, was kind of being treated for being clinically depressed. My sister suffered from depression almost her entire teenage through adult life. In fact, she took her own life, and that's partially because of her depression 5 years ago. So I have a very personal connection to this disease. And that kind of colors the way that I look at this now, whereas 5 years ago, I probably wouldn't have looked at it the same. I've also had moments in my life of depression. I've never been diagnosed as being depressed because most of my depression was temporary, brought about by instances like people that I've lost in my life. But those are my personal connections. And then if I take a look, if we go back to here and you see the other thing is value analysis, the other thing when I'm looking at this picture is that I think it's really effective because I feel like it really gives you the idea of being stuck and wanting to move forward, maybe into the room or into the light, but not feeling like you're able to, like you don't have the energy to actually get up and do it. So I believe that this is a pretty effective piece. Okay, composition. This is a symmetrically balanced piece. The weight of this here is balanced over here. The weight of the light is balanced by the dark. And even though it's not a mirror image, our subject is pretty much right in the center of the piece, vertically and horizontally. So we're looking at a pretty balanced piece, and I think that that is deliberate, particularly having this extra darkness over here to balance out the white on this side, and the fact that there is more dark, in generally, than there is the light over here kind of gives us that message about what depression is like. Angle, we are on level with the subject, and we're at about a mid-range level to that subject. And I think that's done deliberately as well. If we're placed above the subject looking down, then we might get this feeling of how the subject is inferior to us. If we were below, then it's superior to us. And I think this way we kind of view ourselves as this person's friend. And we're right there on the floor basically with him, which could either mean that we need to be there for someone who's going through this depression to kind of help them through, or it could mean that we are just as likely to have these feelings at some point in our lives as he is. Therefore, we're on the same level, the same playing field. Color. This is a grayscale, and I think the grayscale is extremely appropriate. If it were in color, this picture I think was taken in like the late 1970s. I mean, I'm only saying that because of maybe the style of the hair and some things like that. But color would really show the time period and like defining details and maybe distract us from the overall message of the piece. Color would also bring out maybe a little bit more distinguishing characteristics of this person's face. And so therefore, because we are able to put this in any time period and any person there, it sort of brings about the message that depression is something that can strike anyone at any time. And that's where I get from this piece. So hopefully that helps you give an understanding of what we're going to be doing coming up in the future. And thanks for listening.